Hey, Napoleon, what did you do all last summer again? I told you, spent it in Alaska hunting wolverines. Did you shoot any? Yes, like 50 of them. They're trying to attack my cousins. What the heck would you do in a situation like that? What kind of gun did you use? A freaking 12 gauge. What do you think? Napoleon Dynamite. Man, you don't get much more early 2000s than this. This defined a generation of kids like myself who were born in the 90s, but definitely were coming of age and growing up in the early 2000s. For my specific group of people who belong to like this subculture of Latter-day Saints, Napoleon Dynamite definitely had a huge impact. I mean, in general, the directorial debut of LDS filmmaker Jared Hess touched a lot of people and definitely had a huge impact on cinema as a whole, especially in furthering the indie film movement. But if we're talking about films that were formative to me specifically, or at least movies that pretty much defined who I am and kind of helped develop my personality growing up, Napoleon Dynamite was one of those movies. 15 years ago, it exploded in the indie film scene and eventually expanded to greater theaters, and was hugely profitable considering its budget. But for me, I didn't initially see it when it was in theaters. I later saw it when we got it on DVD in 2005. It was one of those movies that I simply could not put down. I found the whole entire thing hilarious. I never found it boring, despite the kind of unorthodox story structure. And to this day, I mean, despite the fact that I can point out flaws and definitely admit it's not a perfect movie, I always am entertained and laugh out loud every single time I put it on. Napoleon Dynamite also has a special place in my heart for the fact that it was the very first Blu-ray that I ever purchased from my collection that is now about 400 movies strong. Over 10 years ago, I purchased that Napoleon Dynamite from the Best Buy that's over at the now defunct Fiesta Mall, and now it is still a treasured part of my collection despite the fact that there's a scratch on the disc that always makes it skip at that first scene when the Happy Hands Club performs in a classroom. But whatever way you put it, Napoleon Dynamite had a huge impact on pop culture back in the day, and given that it just had its 15th anniversary of releasing in theaters, I wanted to look back on it and see how it held up today. It's interesting that this should be my next review after Once Upon a Time in Hollywood though, because that movie to me feels much more low energy and structurally free compared to other Tarantino movies. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood kind of feels like one scene after another just kind of progressing into one another, and you can't really pinpoint a specific plot or a narrative that's really going on. It just continues on, and the pacing sometimes dips because of that. In a way, Napoleon Dynamite operates on a similar structure, although the key problem that I have, and certainly other people have with it too, is that it really doesn't have any definable narrative or plot whatsoever. I remember scrolling through channels one day, and there was one day in which I saw a description of Napoleon Dynamite while it was playing on TV, and literally the plot description was Napoleon Dynamite was trying to help Pedro win the class presidency. But to be honest, that doesn't really come up until the third act of the movie. It pretty much is the thing that ushers us into the final half an hour of the film. And so up until that point, there's no real indication that that's where the story is leading to its climax. Instead, Napoleon Dynamite is the key example of an indie filmmaker just trying to express himself and to make something that is very personal and also quirky and idiosyncratic in its own way. Because of that, this film is pretty much free of a narrative, and at least in terms of typical plot structure, there's no real definable first act, second act, or third act. This kind of feels like one comedic set piece leading into another. But the good thing is that I find for the most part these comedic sequences to be iconic and incredibly entertaining to watch every single time I put this on. In particular, some of my favorites include the scene in which Uncle Rico and Kip are in the bowling alley, and then Napoleon Dynamite's dance sequence, the grapefruit scene, which is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. Really, there are just a lot of random scenes that occur in this movie that not always connect with each other and kind of just sporadically happen in the narrative, but they're all entertaining. Because of that, I can forgive the fact that this movie doesn't really have that much of a narrative or a plot at all, because the sequences that we do see, even though they don't really have much of a flow, they at least are very entertaining to watch, and I never feel bored because of that. There are two other big reasons why this is the case. One, because of the excellent screenplay and direction from Jared Hess and his wife Jerusha, and then of course the performances too. First off, I really appreciate that Napoleon Dynamite has a distinct and unique feel and look to it. To me, this feels like Jared Hess trying to emulate the early days of Wes Anderson, you know, like the Bottle Rocket and Rushmore days, where there is definitely a lot of symmetry in the imagery he's using. The color grading is a bit muted and a bit blurry, but in other cases it's heightened in order to, you know, saturate certain colors or emphasize other things more. Otherwise too, just the dialogue and the presentation of it all, it definitely feels a bit more offbeat than your traditional sort of comedy, but it all works. It still kind of feels grounded in reality while also heightening other things to where it's hilarious every time you watch it. And that style of comedy goes after more of a quirky, deadpan, and awkward sort of embarrassing type of humor, which for me, that's not always my favorite because in studio comedies, they drag out certain sequences to try to prolong the joke and distract you from the story to where suddenly those scenes aren't funny anymore and they just come off as pathetic attempts at humor. Here, Jared Hess seems to understand how to actually harness that tone in his filmmaking, whether or not that's with long shots, with perfectly timed awkwardness, if that makes sense, and then just the performances that his actors give. It goes without saying that Jon Heder is absolutely iconic in the role as Napoleon Dynamite. There's nothing really I can say there. But Jon Gries is the standout here, in my opinion, because he is able to craft out a character who is so stuck in the past and is so wrapped up in his version of toxic masculinity that it is absolutely hilarious to try to see him recapture his youth while also stuck in like this 40-year-old man body. It provides a lot of situational humor because you want to laugh at this guy and also hate him for who he is and how he tries to use his personality to inflict his will on others. And like I said, that grapefruit scene that he has is one of the greatest things I've ever seen in a movie. And of course, there's also this amazing sequence with the steak, too.
Watch this. What the heck are you doing?
That's what I'm talking about.
Of course, I also love the actors who play Kip, Deb, Pedro. All of them are iconic characters for a reason. They do enough to work with Jared Hess's style to where they make embarrassing and quiet and awkward humor work. In the end, Napoleon Dynamite is a film that I recognize has flaws, but is one that I never not want to watch because all of the humorous sequences in this movie are pitch perfect, well, for the most part anyway. My only hope is that future generations after me will be able to appreciate this movie for what it is, separate from the cultural context, and that it will continue to grow in the estimation of others as they look to kind of the more quirky and idiosyncratic comedies that some of the best directors out there like Taika Waititi, Wes Anderson, and others are known for. With that, I'm giving Napoleon Dynamite a B+. As far as an age recommendation goes, there's not really much at all in this movie that I would consider to be inappropriate. I mean, there are definitely some anatomical references that might be a bit awkward for some. I am referring to the fact that at one point, Uncle Rico tries to sell bust enhancements to a lot of different women. And some parents might also be bothered by the use of slang words in this movie, like frickin' in particular. But again, those aren't like the strongest profanities out there at all. If I'm gonna give an age recommendation to this movie, I would say it's probably best for people who are at least 10 years old. Thanks again for watching, guys. I will have more Retro Movie Minute videos later this month. I actually have 2 more planned. They will be surprises though. I'm not really going to mention what they are. I will just be eager to film them and show them to you when they're done. Otherwise, look forward to more reviews coming soon. And if you like this video, please like and subscribe as well. In addition, check out my Facebook, Letterboxd, and Instagram pages that are linked in the description below, so you can find more content that you wouldn't normally find here on YouTube. In the end though, thank you for watching as always, and you have a good one.